Hi, and welcome to our third installment of the Graduate Nursing Student Development Series. Today, we welcome Father Dominic Bouck. He is the chaplain and director of the university ministry here at the University of Mary. As you may or may not know, there are 4 graduate competencies that the university has outlined for us. These are scholarship, communication, professional distinction, and moral courage. I feel like in graduate nursing, we do a really good job of covering scholarship and communication, but sometimes we struggle with helping our students develop the competencies of moral courage and professional distinction. I think some of this is due to the online environment, but we do notice in our end of program surveys that students say that they did not get quite as much information on these topics as they would like. So in order to enlighten us all, I asked Father Bouck to join us today to talk about moral courage and professional distinction, just whatever he thinks is important for us to know. And I am recording this, so I hope to share it with all of our current students who were not able to join us today. And then my hope is that we can turn this lesson into a meaningful assignment for our future students. So thank you, Father Bouck, for being here with us and sharing your wisdom. And whenever you're ready, take it away.
Great. Thanks so much. It's good to be with you all. And let's start with a prayer. Good and gracious God, we thank you for all of your gifts. We thank you for the gift of creation, the gift of the human person. Help us to participate in your wisdom and to receive an outpouring of the Holy Spirit on us, that we might be given the gifts of knowledge and understanding, but also courage to carry out the truths that we know from our study and from our faith. We ask this through Christ our Lord. Amen. All right. Well, thank you for inviting me to speak today. Essentially, well, I'll just start with that kind of a story. Like, we had this professional development that you referenced beforehand, but with some of the health sciences staff, and then some of our philosophy faculty and priests, and it was a good, I just thought the event itself was great, and just having all those people in one room. And I was kind of moved myself by a greater humility of not knowing all the answers, and especially just on some of the moral dilemmas that came up on, like, the practical nature of what some of these hardships that arise are. And it was a great experience for me, because I am not an expert in bioethics, but I am pretty well versed in sort of the Catholic philosophical tradition and how that applies to medical situations. But in terms of the kind of the specific hairy examples, there's a lot to learn there. And I grew in greater appreciation of that. I also appreciated in general the openness of the people in that meeting of discussing intentionally hard cases. And that's the appropriate time to do it, is in a sort of an academic classroom setting. And what I like personally, I love principles, and this is probably the number one thing of, if we want to have moral courage or professional distinction or any sort of basis on which to make decisions, it all comes from principles. And if we don't have our principles in order, then what we end up doing is just kind of shooting from the hip at different circumstances that come up. And we all know that this leads to inconsistency in application, and then sort of a never-ending change in how we do things. Sometimes we can kind of just take that for granted because of the change of technology. We're just kind of used to life being different at different, especially the older we get. We're just kind of used to things like, wow, things are way different than they used to be. But if we don't have things that ground us, not just in history, like the kind of crusty old, person who's been at it a while, it says like, I don't want to change, or we're not doing things like we used to, and that's bad, and and then we kind of rightfully like look at that person with suspicion, like, oh well, the way that things were, or just being nostalgic or grumpy, like those aren't virtues. What our virtues are having deep, well thought out philosophical principles, and these ground us in truth rather than in time, right? That they're not conditioned by time. What time changes is the application of these principles, but the principles themselves stay the same. If we kind of look down on crusty people, we could also offer a corrective to people who are always just moving forward to the next new thing, saying, well, that's the way things were done, and everything gets better as time goes on. So we just got to keep, boldly marching towards the progress of the future, and say like, oh, well, of course we would change it what we do, because that's how life works. You just get better as you get older, better as you get closer to the perfect future that we're all working towards. Well, that's not true. I mean, that the most progressive sort of ethicists and scientists of the early 20th century are the ones that were pushing things like the eugenics movement and using science. Now people say it's pseudoscience, but this was coming from a scientific understanding of the human person, saying we're on this march towards progress, and oh, these people don't fit in, so we got to get rid of them, or oh, these people don't fit in, so we don't give them the same human rights as everybody else. There was a big interruption of that with like the major catastrophes of the middle of the 20th century, especially in places like Nazi Germany. But this was going on in the United States. Like this was with various terrible experimentation on Black people with like the Tuskegee experiments, or sort of even in the state of North Dakota, which you would think like, oh, we're just old fashioned here. No, we were very into the eugenics movement. It's forced sterilizations and sort of this idea that we could perfect man by means of science. This idea is not as crudely applied as it was 100 years ago, because some lessons have been learned, but the kind of general principle that it's based on is still pretty alive and well, that we're on this march of progress, and we just keep going forward. Then there's some people who kind of have an instinctive reaction against that, saying like, well, we probably shouldn't gene edit babies. There was just a story the other day about like some Chinese doctor who's going to speak at Oxford, who's kind of like, he got even in China, he got in trouble for the sort of gene manipulation he was doing on children, and he issued this sort of like apology, where it wasn't really an apology. It was just saying like, I probably moved too fast. And we can have that concept from an ethical perspective, like we just can't move too fast, but really what we're doing is we're moving towards this future. And instinctively, when people say like, I don't know about that, well, then the only weapon that you have in your arsenal to sort of back up that claim is to say, why? Because we haven't done it that way. Well, you're 40, then 50, 60, 70, then you get replaced by people who don't have those same scruples that you do. And so then it's just, well, we have done it this way. We have gene edited babies, or we have had assisted suicide for people with mental illness, which I'll talk about. And it's not that same cultural taboo anymore. The key with moral courage and having a philosophical basis that is rooted in eternal truths and timeless truths is to separate ourselves from a sort of either reactionary traditionalism or a sort of blind progressivism, where we're just kind of feeling towards the future, and to say, no, there's things that change, and then there's things that don't change, and the fundamental truths of the human person don't change, and the technologies and modifications that do change, that come up, can be used in certain circumstances, and in other certain circumstances they can't be. Like that's just as college students say, a hard no or a hard pass, right? Like you just have to say, no, we're not going to ever be able to do these things that are now possible for us. If you look at sort of contentious moral issues with regards to the medical world in the past, I don't know, however many years you want to go back, but especially 50 years or 100 years, it's not as if people had some sort of major intellectual conversion on these points. What usually happens is the technology makes it possible, or if it was possible before, it makes it a lot easier and cleaner and safer. And so once those things happen, then it's up to human autonomy just to make the choices that they see fit to make. And then you have ethical boards that really are just responding with time-based arguments that say we're not ready for this, we're not ready for that. And then in 10 years, they're ready for it. And then, there's something else that comes up they're not ready for. So then 10 years, we'll come up with that. Or it's appeals to emotion and individual circumstances, where it's like, well, in this individual circumstance, there's a whole new category of things because of how I feel or because of what they say. And then it's no wonder that there's no rootedness, no things that change. Sometimes people can give sort of, we don't really, it's not like directly religious people. Sometimes people use language of faith to take a firm stand, because faith is something that you can take a firm stand on. But it's truly it's a way of thinking. It's a principled, ordered approach to these questions, and they can mistake that for a curmudgeonliness, like I was talking about before. But sometimes it's true, on the other hand, to say yes, slippery slope arguments aren't effective. I think people rightly kind of say, like, yeah, slippery slope arguments kind of just are rooted in that old-fashionedness, like, well, if we do this, then this is going to come, and that doesn't really appeal to our rational nature, and so people dismiss those arguments, and that's probably right that they should. But when we take a philosophical stand on something, or take a position on something, and the rest of sort of the ethical community, such as that is, moves on beyond those principles that we've kind of stood firm on, we can look sometimes to say it was still wrong back when we had this point of departure from our ethical theories, and we're still standing on that point. But just so you guys are aware, like, look how far you've come from those original argumentations that you made. I think assisted suicide is easily is the most easy thing to see this, where in developed Western, intellectual, educated, well-to-do countries of Europe, and now Canada and the United States, that the growth of assisted suicide has just it's been exponential since it was first debuted just over 25 years ago in the Netherlands, and in sort of a more formal way. But the expansion of it, it used to be, in a lot of these places, it used to be, okay, if you have an extreme terminal illness, and with the consultation of 2 doctors and a board that evaluates it, and this whole narrow circumstance, then, and only then, right, then you can have the freedom to end your life in the way that you want to live it. Right. So right there's a philosophical departure to say that, no, we don't actually have the right to end our life when we choose. Even that's even my personal privacy and autonomy end at a certain point with my relation to the common good, and I'm actually not able to do that. Well, that sets off this whole firestorm of what it means to be a human being, what is the good. And you can see how we need so much philosophy and training to even start to consider these matters. In my humility with the nursing faculty and our kind of day of discussion on these things, I would offer that in the same way that I don't know all the medical procedures as they're sort of fully practiced, and that's something that I can grow in. I think medical professionals often have a gift, which is also a weakness, in a pragmatism. It can be a sort of like, well, in this circumstance, this is what they need, and you can see how that happens. Like, if you're trying to make the human body function well, right, there can be very specific ways to do that, and you get, well, X is happening, so we got to do Y. Hearing nurses when they watch like TV shows or football games or something, it's always fun. Like, oh yeah, that's obviously a I was watching a football game with a nursing student, and she was talking about, like, oh, he got an air cast, so blah 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 blah. And it's like, wow, that's impressive. For me, it's just like, oh, bone broken, something like that. But they had all these terminologies, and again, that's somewhere that I could grow in it. But conversely, for the medical professional in difficult circumstances, moral courage is good, but it's always dependent on principles. If you want to be courageous, you have to have something to stand on. And when the winds of conflict arise and try to blow you from your position, if all you have is some sort of emotional conviction, or even like a conviction because of your faith, those things don't your foundation isn't built on solid ground. It's built on sort of either an philosophical and anti-intellectual sort of just stubbornness, and we would rightly say we don't like that, or you change because of pressure on the outside. If instead the philosophical concepts and the principles are understood in how they fit together and how they work, then you don't come off like a curmudgeon, and you don't just get sucked into whatever the current situation is saying. And so it's important for like moral courage not just to have a sort of tenacity or grittiness. It's also important to have deep philosophical understanding of why things are the way they are, and what the purpose of life is, and what the human person is. And you can see, as you list all the topics that would need to be understood, like that's like a whole extra course of study. And I think sometimes people, I know this in the world of faith, you get a lot, sometimes people say like, oh yeah, Father, I used to serve mass when I was 10, and the sisters taught me in 3rd grade and all this stuff. So I know. It's like, no way. You can get doctorates in theology. You can, like, unless you just think people that study advanced studies of ethics and philosophy and theology are just kind of like sitting around all day smoking pipes and, I don't know what, drinking cognac. Like, no, there's a lot more ways to think. And that was revealed to me even in that nursing discussion, where it's like, these are real cases that need philosophical application, and there's more research that I would need to do to talk about it. So even after all my years of study, like, there's still more study to be done. Well, the same goes for medical professionals to say, oh yeah, I took my required ethics course when I was an undergrad, and that solved all the problems for me. It's like, no, that was like the briefest of thinking through things in the most kind of catchy way possible, just to get you through the day without making some major moral decision that is contrary, right? And then that's why we have ethical boards and things like that, but also to say, like, those people need to be really trained and well thought out, and have a humility to say, I don't know all the answers, and I need to research more on this, and to think more about it, and to consult more about it. I love consulting, so it's easy for me. And we have to have, for our professionals too, they have to have that same attitude to say, like, I don't know everything, and I don't know the principles of everything, and I can consult people who know more than I do, and that's great, and that's life, and that's good. Why would we want to think that we knew everything? It's kind of a sad existence. I would always hope that there's more to be known, right? That I don't have a comprehensive knowledge of the truth. And so when we can kind of understand these things and point to them where we have a major point of departure on something like assisted suicide, then we can also point out, not as our argumentation for why we think what we think. Slippery slopes don't justify what we think. We justify what we think by means of philosophical architecture, that things build on other things, and then that's how things are. But as an illustration, as an added point to reveal some sorts of things, we could say, did anyone think, 25 years ago, when these conversations really were beginning, and Dr. Kevorkian was the rogue guy in Michigan or wherever, and and we kind of were thinking like, there's these extreme cases, and that's all we're going to allow. They didn't even think that, like in Canada, that they're going to have the possibility for assisted suicide for people who are mentally ill. Like, that's a terrible thing. And if you can't agree that someone who's riddled with a terminal illness and is very aged and all these other sorts of things, if you can't get on board with that one, well, like, there is the argumentation to say, so what are your principles? You can turn it back onto these people and say, well, so what are your principles? Are your principles only what's socially acceptable, and we're always trying to move to a more progressive reality that doesn't have any justification for what it thinks? It's just all based on personal autonomy. And at least to even say them that, like, to say personal autonomy is the only good. Well, then you say, you don't really think that, right? And to even say things like, if someone came to you and said, I want to kill myself, you would say, if you're your friend, would you say, yeah, well, you do you should, yeah, okay, how can I help you? It's instead you say, no, we need to get you the help that you deserve. So even instinctively we know that. But to help our people that don't agree with our positions, whether it's in the day-to-day of coworkers, or kind of more broadly speaking, when big decisions are being made as a whole, to say, what are your principles? I can't debate with someone about assisted suicide if I don't know, like, what they think on a deep level. Otherwise, we're just talking about uh, totally different universes. We say things like good, we say things like human person, we say things like autonomy, free will, but we don't really mean anything by those things. I'm saying like apple and they're saying orange, and we have the same word for it. But the concepts that and the principles that led us to have that position are so unalike that we might as well be speaking in a different language. In fact, if we were speaking a different language, at least there'd be the humility or the understanding to say, help me understand how you mean the words that you mean, because I have different meanings for my words. This is what happens with transgender. I was just someone in my classes asking about transgender and how to like approach that, different things like that. That's obviously a very heated and long topic. One easy thing to say is like, even more so than assisted suicide, we've been very formally thinking about these things as a culture for a very short time, right? These are not concepts that have been well thought out. And if your idea is, well, we always got to be pushing, well, then that should be illustrated as your philosophy. But that doesn't seem like much of a philosophy. It's just pushing. And so if you're in a discussion with someone, it's really to get down to the ultimate principles of why they think what they think, and then we can start making progress. If you don't do that, what I told them, this is PG-13, I guess, or whatever, but it's like you just end up talking about penises at a certain point. And it's like, is that the discussion that we want to have? Is that like where we want to focus our intellectual energy on? Because just to say, well, it's obvious what a man is or what a woman is, and the other side says it's not obvious, it's this internal thing or whatever, and then you just start talking about genitals. Well, there's no hope. There's no hope for that argument to make any progress, because you're just talking about genitals when the conversation is much deeper. It's about the human person. It's about the common good. It's about the role of choice and will and ethical decisions and legitimate limits on autonomy and the like. So if you can help someone see what the logical conclusions of their principles are, then there's hope. But you have to first see them too. This is the other problem. The humility, St. Thomas Aquinas is the best at showing this in the Catholic tradition. And some people misapply St. Thomas Aquinas and they say like, well, Aquinas said this, or Aquinas said that, or the church says this, or the church says that. That's not how the Catholic intellectual tradition functions or grew. How does it happen? It happens through love and through charity and talking and listening, to be able to articulate the other person's position even better than they can articulate their position. It's not about scoring points, and it's not about like winning. It's about first understanding most deeply, like again, even better than your debate partner, even better than they can articulate their position, you can articulate their position. You can say, this is why you think what you think. And then you can say, and our point of departure is precisely at this point, which isn't at penises. It's at, the understanding of the human person, the understanding of the body, the understanding of life and dignity. These much deeper issues. And so that's why people who disagree could be friends, because they could say, well, I don't agree on this point with them, but that's because we don't agree on this deep level, but we have an understanding where it's not just name calling or point scoring. It's like, we just have two very, very different ways of understanding the human person. And then you can tease them and say, well, and they're okay with this. And the other person can tease them and say, well, yeah, but you're, stuck in this time. And there's some ability to like articulate it and go back and forth with it. But if we just say like, well, obviously they're thinking about the things that I'm thinking about in the exact same way, but we disagree on this hot button issue. That's almost never the case. What's happening is they're thinking about everything in a totally different structural format than I'm thinking about it. And I'm thinking about it in this way. And of course we would disagree on this issue. I could have told you that immediately, right? And we don't even need to spend much time talking about it, because the deep principles that we know aren't even close. But most people don't ever get to that point where they're actually talking about the deep principles. That's why it was so good to have that conversation in the School of Health Sciences, because we already know to some extent, and again, everyone can learn more, but we have some idea of what the principles are. Then you plug into the principles the crazy circumstances and the wild uh, situations that arise in life, but you plug them into I already have a very clear, well thought out framework of thinking, and then I plug those in. Then moral courage comes in and says, what's the most we can do in a situation that preserves the goods ordered according to their true ordering? How can we be creative about it? How can we apply it rightly, mercifully, lovingly, all this other stuff? And then, and only then, where's the line in which I'm going to have to make a hard decision that's not going to be popular? And that should be the most limited, tiny aspect of my thinking, right? My whole thinking should be this giant construction, this architectural framework, and on the pinnacle of one of the spires should be this one circumstance. But to reveal it to that person, they have to walk through the whole building to see how I got to that point. And then, because I have a firm foundation, because I'm strong, then I can make a morally courageous decision. This is essential to not just people of faith, but to everyone. If you look back in history, like I don't know what people think. If people think, one dumb religious example is sometimes people say like, "Oh, I'd love to be on time, on earth at the time of Jesus." If they're kind of a devout Christian, that I'd love to be on earth at the time of Jesus, just to walk with him and listen to him, and oh, that would have just been great. Instead of having to go to mass and listen to a lousy homily or go to church and listen, I could listen to Jesus himself. And then, like, what's really true though is if you were back in that time, you'd probably have been one of the persons saying like, crucify him, right? You'd be like, I don't know who this clown is. What's he going on saying I'm the Son of God? Well, it's the same thing. People look back in history and they always think, this phrase that's really problematic philosophically, but being on the right side of history. Everyone thinks that if I would have gone back in time, I would have been on the right side of history. There's no real reason to think that, right? And especially if you're not living a principled life, why would you think that you would have been living a principled life 100 years ago when you're not living or thinking according to deep atemporal principles now? Because if you find yourself very much comfortable with whatever medical ethics is teaching in the current way at major universities or according to laws, well, then that's your philosophical principle, as I teach whatever, or I believe whatever's current and popular and legal. Well, I mean, there's a lot of things that you look back at in history in this country that were current, that were popular, and that were legal, and that we recognize rightly now as atrocities, contrary to the dignity of the human person. So if you can show someone your principles aren't actually principles, they're just cultural biases, they're taboos, they're fitting in with cultural currents, that's not moral courage, and that's not even philosophical clarity. That's just being someone who's part of the crowd, and the crowd often gets it wrong. And so you can say to those people, yeah, I look like a stick in the mud now, and I don't know if history will vindicate me. History is also changing and written by different people and different cultures, and so that's not an infallible interpreter of the truth either. But there's some people in society that have to take stands, and throughout history we admire those people who have taken stands, and guaranteed if they're taking stands, they're not popular. And so I'm going to take a stand now. You don't maybe recognize it, but I can illustrate why I think what I think. And it's not just being a stick in the mud, it's being a resident of a structure that's well formed and well thought out. And this is the reason why I can go no further in this sort of way of thinking, because it's contrary to a deeply held principle that I'll illustrate for you. But just going along with whatever's current, that's a recipe for every sort of terrible atrocity that's ever been committed. We call someone who has done terrible things a serial killer, but when it was legal, popular, and current in the academy, they weren't thinking that they were serial killers or racist or whatever. They think that they were on the right side of history, but they didn't have a coherent set of principles that illustrated that. And one thing, just kind of from a different world, an illustration from high school that can be applied to high schoolers love fitting in. They actually they primarily just want to disappear. Like, I hope no one is looking at me right now. I don't want to do anything that says, because it could be uh, socially hazardous to kind of put myself out there. So I'm just going to try to blend in as best I can. And what I've noticed happens, and they would say, like, well, what advice do you have for high school students? What I would tell myself and my classmates back when we were high schoolers, or even the ones I see now, which I do tell them when I talk to high schoolers, is to say, when you're with the crowd, that's fine. It's really hard to fit in, but you fit in. Okay. So then people tell you to be yourself, be yourself, be yourself. What happens is people hear that, and then they sort of, you sort of try to be yourself. You sort of put yourself out there, and you try to kind of stand up for something, or stand up for a bully or someone who's being bullied, or stand up for some unpopular belief, or even just to express yourself in some sort of way. And you put your head out there a little bit, and then the bullets come. It's like you come out of your foxhole and it's choo, 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 and people start mocking you, people start making fun of you, people start criticizing you, or they shun you. And then what happens is you go right back down to where you were. You kind of retreat back to, okay, I'm sorry, I shouldn't have done that. What happens though is the people who kind of put themselves out there, you experience a lot of resistance right away, of comments, of critique, of all the terrible things that happen. And then you stay up there long enough and you withstand it. Then all of a sudden people kind of have a general change of attitude towards that. And they say, oh, well, we've kind of unlocked or launched our assault on something different. It hasn't changed. And so actually that becomes attractive now. This mentality can be used for good or for ill. If you just stick with what you believe long enough, and you're confident about it, and you're from a more Christian perspective, you're loving, you're patient, you're kind through it, even though you're firm, then people who regarded you with contempt will either at least will either start to turn and then follow you, or they'll say, well, I disagree with her about some specific thing, but man, she is an admirable person, and no one is more generous than her, and no one is more principled than her, and she knows everything of why she believes what she believes, and she has the humility to ask when she doesn't know, and very kind and patient and everything. It's just this one thing that I don't agree with her on. So then that person goes home, they're like, they're a better person than me, they're more loving than me, they're more kind than me, except on this one thing. And I hate it that they think that thing, but maybe there's a reason why they think what they think, right? And if we can, in moral courage, convince people of that, then that's where the professional acumen and distinction comes in, is to say, those crazy Catholics, you think of like a Catholic hospital, those crazy Catholic hospitals, man, they don't do tubal ligations. Right? Okay. So you say, wow, that is old fashioned. That is dumb. We've been doing tubal ligations forever. Everyone has tubal ligations. Why can't they just do tubal ligations? But then if all of our nursing staff and all of our doctors and all of our support staff are the most generous and the most professional and the most talented and kind and patient and loving and generous, then that one weird thing sticks out, but it's like, it just doesn't quite make sense from an outside view. It's like, I love everything else that they do. They have the best hospitals, they have the best doctors, they have the best nurses, they're the kindest, and they're just weird in a couple different ways. And then once they open themselves to that, like so why don't you do that? They say, because that's what the church teaches. Okay, well, you just blew it. Right? You can't, well, that's the way we've always done it. Okay, you blew it again. And I say, okay, do you have 6 years? Let's start a conversation that's going to take 6 years of understanding why we do what we do, or why we think what we think. Now, a lot of times people say, like, well, what's your elevator pitch? And we should be good at that, but we should also not betray the fact that if you don't understand why we wouldn't do tubal ligations or assisted suicide, then we're going to have to do a lot of legwork before we even talk about those things. We can have catchy sayings or sort of little buzzwords or argument points, apologetics, but really what's going to convert the mind is seeing what are the deep reasons of why we think everything that we think. And once people can understand that, they can say, okay, well, I know they don't do this and I disagree with it, but I can see how it's internally coherent with their whole vision as a human person. And they're, again, best in all these other ways. And I'm starting to be, this is the interlocutor who's not convinced of these sorts of things. I'm starting to be a little bit uncomfortable with my own hospital because they're allowing mentally ill patients to euthanize themselves. And I can't quite articulate it right now, but I'm not comfortable with that. Or they're doing late term abortions. I'm not comfortable with that. Or, and then there's an openness to say, well, maybe there's a lot of other things I'm not comfortable with that I've been conditioned to be comfortable with, and I can have sort of a change of understanding. But that depends on the most professional and the most courageous individuals who represent those points and who aren't afraid to kind of go deeper and to ask questions and to understand deeply on their own level and the level of the people who are talking to them. So in this country, Catholic hospitals in Catholic schools, we're regarded with suspicion for a variety of major historical reasons that stretch back millennia, literally, and oceans and thousands of miles. But I think they were, I wasn't alive during the late 1800s or the middle 20th century or something like that. But these institutions that Catholics set up were regarded with a certain reverence to say, wow, their schools are great. Their hospitals are great. Like they're quality institutions. And I don't agree with what they're saying on certain things, but man, they have a top tier way of doing things. And I think some of that's with a lot of the decline of our religious orders, with these nuns who were kind of stoic and sort of like revered people in their community before even women's rights were much of a thing on people's radars, that these nuns were walking around running colleges and universities and hospitals with great dignity, that you might not like the Catholic faith or like some of the moral teachings, but you say she's a respected member of the community, or the priest. You get these movies like On the Waterfront or whatever. It's like, I don't know if I agree with him, but man, he was willing to stand up to the difficulties that were present in the community. And so that goes for Christian believers of all sorts, not just priests and nuns, but of all Christians, especially as these institutions transition from sort of outgrowths of very intentional communities and are transferred to sort of boards. You can delete this part about it, but a board is about the most like entrusting hard decisions to a board, or decisions about institutions to a board, simply is not how the human person functions. Human persons function like a family, like with leadership and with confidence, not constantly seeking how do we not get sued and what's our optics on this and different things. And those things are important. We don't want to get sued and we want to have good optics, but to say we need moral courage and moral leadership from the top that's rooted in our identity and rooted in our philosophical ways of thinking, and not just fear of litigation. And then we can proceed from those and sort of call on the people who work for those institutions to have the same level of commitment that the religious who established them had. But that's a very tall order. It's not easy to do. But if we want to not just have the same institutions that are down the street with a cross on them, then that level of buy-in and commitment and individual courage and professional development have to be present with everyone who works at that hospital or that school. So that's about all I have.
Thank you very much. I'm going to pause this recording.